Qaswa, the camel of Prophet Muhammad, carries a story that is both simple and profound, a story that reaches beyond the surface of an animal and enters into the realm of symbolism, humility, and divine destiny. The animals connected to the life of the Prophet are remembered with reverence because they were chosen to serve him, to accompany him, and to be part of the divine story of Islam. Among them, Qaswa stands out as the most recognized and remembered. Qaswa was a she-camel that belonged to the Prophet, purchased after his migration from Mecca to Madinah. The camel was strong, faithful, and well suited for the long and difficult journeys of the desert. But what made Qaswa unique was not just her physical features or her service. It was how Allah used her as a means of sign, of guidance, and of honor in several key moments of the Prophet's mission. To Muslims, she became more than an animal. She was a witness to revelation, to migration, to battles, to pilgrimage, and to the Prophet's final years. When the Prophet made the Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina, it was Qaswa who carried him on that historic journey. This was not an ordinary journey, but one that marked the turning point in Islamic history. It was the transition from persecution to community, from oppression to freedom, from the early hidden call to the open establishment of Islam. Qaswa's role in this migration immortalized her name, for she bore the messenger of Allah across the deserts as he left behind his homeland, his family, and everything familiar for the sake of Allah. The loyalty of the camel and her endurance mirrored the loyalty and endurance required of the early Muslims. She was steady, patient, and unwavering, a silent partner in one of the most monumental events in Islamic history. Her significance did not stop there. Upon arrival in Madinah, the Prophet allowed Qaswa to wander freely, saying that she was commanded by Allah and that she would stop where Allah willed. The camel walked through the streets of Madinah as the people eagerly hoped she would stop at their house, for hosting the messenger of Allah was the greatest honor they could imagine. Qaswa continued walking until she finally knelt at the site where the Masjid al-Nabawi would be built, the central mosque of Islam, the heart of the Muslim world. This act of Qaswa became a clear sign of divine planning, for it was through her kneeling that the sacred site of the Prophet's mosque was chosen. This was not mere chance. It was destiny guided by Allah. The stories of Qaswa also appear in moments of peace and war. She was the camel the Prophet rode during the Battle of Badr, the first major confrontation between the Muslims and the Quraysh. The sight of the Prophet mounted on Qaswa inspired the companions, reminding them that their struggle was for truth and guided by Allah's support. The same camel carried him in the Battle of Uhud, and though the Muslims faced difficulty, the presence of the Prophet on Qaswa symbolized perseverance and courage in the face of hardship. Another defining moment came during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet and his companions had set out to perform Umrah, but the Quraysh opposed them, leading to negotiations that tested the patience of the Muslims. At Hudaybiyah, Qaswa suddenly knelt and refused to move forward. The companions thought she was stubborn, but the Prophet corrected them, saying she was not stubborn, for that was not her nature. Rather, she was prevented by the one who prevented the elephant in the year of the elephant from entering Mecca. This was a profound reminder that the will of Allah governs all things, even the steps of a camel, and that his decree unfolds with wisdom even when it seems difficult to understand. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah turned out to be a victory for Islam, despite appearing as a setback, and Qaswa's refusal to move was part of that divine plan. Qaswa was also present during the farewell pilgrimage, when the Prophet addressed the largest gathering of Muslims he had ever spoken to. Mounted on Qaswa, he delivered his farewell sermon, a timeless message that summarized the principles of Islam, the sanctity of life, the equality of all believers, the fulfillment of trust, the prohibition of oppression, and the finality of revelation. The sight of the messenger of Allah on his camel, speaking to a sea of believers, is an image of unity, strength, and the fulfillment of his mission. It was on Qaswa that he declared he had conveyed the message and fulfilled the trust given to him by Allah. For those who were present, Qaswa became inseparable from the memory of that historic moment, for she carried the Prophet during his last sermon to the Ummah. Beyond the great events, Qaswa's story also shows the humility of the Prophet. Despite being the messenger of Allah, he treated his camel with kindness, care, and gentleness. He did not see himself as above the animals that served him. He mended his own saddle, cared for his mounts, and never burdened them beyond their capacity. This teaches Muslims a profound lesson in leadership and humility. Greatness does not come from pride or harshness, but from mercy and responsibility. The Prophet showed that even an animal should be respected, treated with compassion, and recognized as part of Allah's creation. Qaswa also carried symbolic weight in how people saw her. Owning and riding a camel like Qaswa could have been a mark of pride for anyone else, but the Prophet never displayed pride in her. She was known for her endurance and loyalty, but the Prophet always directed praise to Allah, never to himself. When Qaswa knelt at Hudaybiyah, the Prophet reminded the companions that animals do not act out of their own stubbornness in such cases, but by the will of Allah. This constant redirection to Allah teaches Muslims not to become attached to creation in a way that blinds them from the Creator. The passing of Qaswa after the death of the Prophet was a sorrowful moment, for she was tied so closely to him. Some narrations mention that she lived out her days quietly and without the same attention once her master had passed away. It was as though her significance was bound to him, and when he left the world, the purpose of her role faded too. Yet her memory lived on in the stories of the companions, in the history of the Hira, in the site of the Prophet's mosque, and in the farewell pilgrimage. Reflecting on Qaswa's story in the modern world brings lessons for Muslims facing challenges of mindset, identity, and resilience. Just as Qaswa carried the Prophet through deserts, battles, and pilgrimages, every believer has their own Qaswa moments when they must carry the weight of responsibility, when they must endure hardship, and when they must kneel in submission to Allah's decree, even if it does not align with their plan. Qaswa reminds us that submission to Allah's will is the true essence of Islam, and that trust in Him will always lead to the best outcome, even if it appears delayed or difficult. Her story also highlights leadership grounded in humility. The Prophet, despite being the leader of an entire community, rode a simple camel, not a lavish display of wealth. In today's world of materialism and pride, Qaswa's image stands as a reminder that leadership is not about showing off, but about serving with humility. Carrying responsibility with dignity, treating even the smallest creation with respect, and fulfilling one's role with sincerity. These are the true marks of greatness. In the life of every Muslim, Qaswa serves as a metaphor for patience, guidance, and destiny. She represents the idea that Allah chooses the means by which his plans unfold. Just as she knelt at the spot of the Prophet's mosque, Allah guides our steps in ways we may not always understand, but that ultimately serve a greater wisdom. Just as she refused to move at Hudaybiyah, teaching the companions that Allah's decree cannot be forced, our own plans sometimes pause or stop, reminding us to submit to his will. And just as she carried the Prophet during his farewell sermon, Qaswa reminds us that our mission in life is to carry forward the message of Islam, to embody it in our character, and to pass it to those who come after us. Qaswa's story is not only a part of Sirah, the biography of the Prophet, but also a living lesson for every believer. In her loyalty, we see the loyalty we must have to Allah and his messenger. In her endurance, we see the endurance needed in times of trial. In her submission, we see the submission required of a Muslim to the will of Allah. And in her connection to the Prophet, we see the honor of serving the Deen in any capacity, however small it may seem. For those who look at her story with reflection, Qaswa becomes more than a camel of history. She becomes a teacher of mindset, of patience, of trust, and of destiny. Through her, we learn that nothing in the Prophet's life was without purpose, that every detail carries a lesson, and that even the steps of a camel were part of Allah's grand design for his final messenger. To remember Qaswa is to remember the journey of Islam itself, from Mecca to Madinah, from hardship to ease, from uncertainty to certainty, and from trial to victory.